Okay, Chapter 33, Section 4. The Cold War divides the world. In this section, we're going to look at the superpowers that supported opposing sides in the Latin American and Middle Eastern conflicts during the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. After World War II, many nations in Africa, Asia, and Latin America had serious problems. They were plagued by ethnic conflict, lack of education and technology. Poverty was a serious issue, and political unrest. And some of these countries tried to stay neutral in the Cold War, but others actively sought American or Soviet aid. In Cuba, the United States supported a dictator in the 1950s. In 1959, Fidel Castro led a successful revolt. He then turned to the Soviets for aid. In 1962, the Soviets and Americans actually almost went to war over Soviet nuclear missiles placed in Cuba. Now, the Soviets finally pulled the missiles out, and over time the Cuban economy became more and more dependent on Soviet aid. And when the Soviet Union collapsed and dropped communism in 1991, this aid stopped, and it was a serious blow to Cuba's economy. And the United States also supported a dictator in Nicaragua. He fell in 1979 to communist rebels, and when the new government began helping leftist rebels in nearby El Salvador, the United States struck back and began to support forces in Nicaragua that wanted to overthrow the communists. The Civil War lasted, for more than a decade, and finally, the different sides agreed to hold free elections. In the Middle East, often saw conflict between those who wanted a modern, more Western-style society and those who wanted to follow traditional Islam, and such a struggle took place in Iran. In the 1950s, a group tried to take control of the government from the Shah, or the ruler, who was pro-West, and the United States helped the Shah to defeat them. And over time, the Shah tried to weaken the influence of the Islamic religion in Iran, and a Muslim leader by the name of Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini led a successful revolt. And in 1979, the Shah was forced to leave the country. Now, Khomeini made Islamic law the law of the land and followed a foreign policy that was strongly against the United States. And he also led his country to a long war with its neighbor, Iraq. The Soviets gained influence in Afghanistan in 1950, and in the 1970s, Islamic rebels threatened the country's communist government. Now, the Soviets sent in troops, and the United States felt its Middle East oil supplies were in danger, and therefore supported the rebels. And in 1989, after a costly occupation, the Soviets finally left Afghanistan. So which confrontation had the most long-lasting significance? Many historians believe it's Cuba because of the close proximity to the United States, and the fact that the United States and the Soviets almost went to war over the Soviet missiles that were placed in Cuba, deem it as probably the most long-lasting significance. Okay, Chapter 33, Section 5, the Cold War Thaws. Now, when Stalin died in 1953, Nikita Khrushchev became the Soviet leader, and soon protest movements in Eastern Europe challenged the Soviets' hold in Eastern Europe. By 1956, protesters in the army toppled the communist government of Hungary. Khrushchev sent in tanks to put the communists back in power. Similar events took place in Czechoslovakia in 1968, and that time it was a new Soviet leader, Leonid Brezhnev, who sent in the tanks. So this Soviet policy in Eastern Europe and China, we see de-Stalinization, which Khrushchev came out and said, okay, Stalin's a bad guy, he did bad things, and our economy is not where it's supposed to be, especially compared to the United States. So he took on this policy of de-Stalinization. And then, of course, like I said, the revolt in Hungary in 1956 and the revolt in Czechoslovakia in 1968, we see the Soviet Union gradually losing its grip and its hold in Eastern Europe. Now, the Soviets, they didn't have the same control over China. Although Soviet Union and China enjoyed friendly relations at first, they gradually grew apart. And in the 1970s, President Richard Nixon began following a policy called détente. And this was what's seen as maybe a lessening of tensions between the superpowers. He became the first U.S. president to visit communist China and the Soviet Union. And in 1972, Nixon and Brezhnev signed a treaty to limit the number of nuclear missiles each country had. So we see different events like the U-2 incident with the space race and the ships between the U.S. and the Soviets. We see this brinkmanship, like on the brink of nuclear war, to a gradual lessening of tensions. And so we have, like I said, the U-2 incident, the Cuban Missile Crisis, which I mentioned in this top section up in here, in the previous section, as well as the escalation of the Vietnam War, Nixon's trip to China, and the SALT I Treaty, and that's where they agreed to limit their number of nuclear missiles each country could have. And then eventually the end of the Vietnam War, we see this slowdown of almost coming to nuclear war to just everything being a little bit less tense. But the U.S. retreated from détente after the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in 1979. In 1981, Ronald Reagan, a fierce anti-communist, became president, and the Soviet Union grew angry over U.S. support for the rebels fighting communists in Nicaragua, and tensions increased again in 1985 when the Soviet Union again got a new leader. Both sides couldn't come up on a new SALT II treaty, where that's the lessening of the nuclear weapons, kind of made things a little bit easier, limiting those kinds of firepower. And then, of course, SDI. Okay, what do you consider the most significant reason for the collapse of détente? Well, détente collapsed because of the refusal to ratify the SALT II treaty, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, which really upset a lot of Americans, especially by 1981 when President Reagan was elected to office, and of course SDI. And that is it.